Welcome back to Man Crossing New Horizons. I'm Dave Darling. I should be see what's going on our lovely island of Fawnhollow today. I'll be vibing out as per usual. I'm slowly building up my backlog, again with videos that I'm recording, so that's always nice, I'd like to say. But by the way, you can, I'm just saying, popped up on the latest two Cuphead episodes, so you got that go. I've got that going for me. Not really like you've got that going for me. That doesn't really make sense. But yeah, we're coming up to the end of the year now. It's very strange to think about, but also not that strange because I've been saying it's strange for like the past week or so. So it's kind of sort of lost its uniqueness in that sense. But anyway, hello everyone. Right now in Fawnhallow, it's 1:40 p.m. on Thursday. Sorry, I can't read. December 29th, 2022. What should we talk about today? I'm not really sure. I don't really have much in mind. What have I been up to? I've just basically been relaxing mostly today. Not doing anything particularly intensive. And I played a new game. Well, not new. It's like old now. Genshin Impact Hour Conquest. That was kind of cool, I guess. That doesn't mean anything to you. I'm going to be honest, but Six and musical, some of her songs are still stuck in my head, not as much as they used to be. It's anytime you discover like something new, which you like, not like you binge it. Well, okay, maybe you do binge it, but like it's not like I binge it. I'm like, yeah, okay, this will consume my mind for a bit, and then now I'm very much on the petering off stage where I'm just like, okay, now I'm listening to other songs again. I've had my stage, listened to that for a little bit, concentrated all that song information, uploaded it to the data banks of my mind. And there you go. Now it's stored in there in a long-term memory, and then that'll be fine. I say it's stored in a long-term memory, but it was definitively not true. Of course. I mean, you might listen to like what a lot of what I say is and be like, wow, you have a surprising like ability to remember random things, and including like song lyrics and that sort of thing. I don't actually think it's as true as you might think. As I say before, I tend to remember things sort of like in broad stroke general. Well, I mean, most people do in broad stroke general things. I'm going to be honest. Well, actually, I'm not sure if that's most people do, but I assume they do. It's sort of like that's how I do it, so I assume everyone else does it that way too, which is probably a very dangerous line of thinking, I'm going to be honest, but harmless in this case, I'd imagine. But at least with the way I remember things, I tend to not remember them in specific details as much as I tend to remember the general sort of feel that something gives me. So if I'm like trying to remember a song, I'll be like, oh, I vaguely remember the sort of impression it gives me, and I sort of remember how the lyrics feel to me. What I don't mean lyrics like how they emotionally impacted me. I mean like how if I try and like how you try and picture something, and it has an intrinsic sort of like, I don't want to say like aura, but it has an intrinsic like it gives you it evokes some sort of sensation in you, but the same way that oh man, I don't even know how to describe this. There's something I actually think about, not all the time, but somewhat often, is the concept of thinking, and what does that mean? But like the way people think is obviously a big thing. I think I might have touched on this before a little bit, but there was a video which was popularized like must have been like a year ago, maybe half a year ago now or something, about this woman. She has aphantasia, and she's also like an artist or something, and she basically made a really interesting video about that sort of thing. Aphantasia basically being you don't have a mind's eye, essentially meaning that you cannot visualize things in your mind, and proportionally 90% of you might be going like, whoa, I didn't know that was a thing, and 10% of you might be listening and being like, you can visualize things in your mind. And it's not even just like it's strange, I suppose, on both sides of the fence to try and comprehend the other, because like if you have aphantasia, you try and like talk to someone being like trying to figure out what like your mind's eye is like what it actually is to like visualize something. It's pretty difficult to describe. It's sort of like you see the image, but your eyes are closed or anything, so it's not like you actually see anything. It's sort of like the concept of when you see an image, you can intrinsically understand the process of seeing, brain processes thing. It's like seeing something, but you don't do the actual physical seeing part, you just do the brain processing part, but it still like has that same sort of reaction sensation. I'm not really sure what that word is, and we'll get back to that description in a sec. But and then it's strange on the other side, because it's sort of just like I wonder how you imagine things, I suppose, when you can't picture things in the first place. And as I understand it, varies from person to person. And at least the woman in that video, she just says she like inherently understands the properties when she tries to like imagine something, but she doesn't visually see it. That's at least my understanding of what she says. And then I thought, it's something you think about more, and it's just like, well, how do I like imagine things? And another thing is a lot of people don't have like an internal voice as well. I don't know the proportions of that exactly, and honestly I don't know aphantasia either, so I think I just made it up off the top of my head, but some of my head was like it's 10%, but which seems a lot higher now I think about it in retrospect, but I'm not really sure. But yeah, some people don't have it in a voice, which means basically that either they can't or they don't like have. They don't, you know, like you don't have it in an ear, I suppose, is perhaps a better way to describe it. It's like you can't hear something speaking out like things to you. So if you see like a sentence, it's not read out like as a voice, and you might be like, do you have it in a voice? Because you're sort of phrasing this in a much stranger way than you were phrasing the aphantasia point. I do have it in a voice, but it's more like I don't use my inner voice like naturally, I suppose. But like it was something which, you know, it's also not something I consciously think about, because in your mind, you know, everything feels the same or similar, right? You know, the concept of saying something aloud in your mind, as well as imagining the same concept that the words would give you in your mind, feel the same, don't they? Or at least very similar, like unless you're consciously trying to like pay attention to it, you would assume you're doing the same thing both times. And it was something that I discovered. It was like I don't naturally like read things out as a dialogue when I see things. The only times I do, I would say, is when I'm simulating a conversation. So like I'm trying to imagine what someone might say to us, or trying to think how I'm going to phrase something, trying to like practice for a speech or something like that. I will use it in a dialogue, or I'm trying to concentrate on something and I don't understand something, like I'm trying to read something over again, then I'll use it in a voice to read it out properly to me, I guess, because then it sort of frames it a different way. But naturally when I read things, I don't like internally say the words when I see them. I sort of just like get the idea from I suppose. It's the best way I can describe it, which that doesn't make sense. It's not like I'm looking at the words and then my mind is like abstractly extracting all the ideas and information from it. It's more like I am still reading it. It's just there's no internal like voice, I suppose, dictating it. It's more like my internal voice is also internal and somehow just comprehending it. I'm not really sure I can properly explain how it works, which is, you know, it's beneficial or not beneficial, I think, in certain ways, because I think having it in a voice, at least the way that inner voice works with me, is that sometimes it's a bit disruptive. You know, it's the same thing as like you're trying to talk while someone else is talking at you, but you're trying to focus on that conversation. It's a bit difficult at the same time to, you know, carry on that trail of thought simultaneously. But the thing is, because I don't have that natural inner voice, it means that I can kind of do it simultaneously. So you might see that sometimes in some of my Let's Plays, where I will like continuously talk about something, you know, my usual sort of rambly whatever way, while like instructions or something appear on the screen, and then I would just do what the instructions say sort of like intrinsically. And it's only when I think about it a bit more, being like, what did those instructions say, I can't recall it because I didn't like internally read it out, so there's nothing to remember. It's just my brain took the processes and be like, oh, these are the vague ideas which came from it, and then processed that without like actually reading it. If that makes sense? Does that make sense? I don't know how to describe this. It's so like difficult to describe. But it's another thing where I find quite often, which happens is, especially with word like association, I suppose, is perhaps how I describe it. Like when I'm trying to remember a word which I've forgotten, I will think of words which have similar other words, which feel similar to it. A lot of the time it's based off sound, but it's not always based off sounds. Like every sort of word gives a different feeling, right? Like I don't know, what would be a good word? Like wood. Okay, you know, that's a feeling. What other words give a similar feeling sort of to wood? Door's kind of similar, but it's not really the same. And you might be like, okay, what about something like woad? Does that give a similar feeling to wood? It doesn't really. It kind of does, but I wouldn't say it's that closely related. It's certainly less closely related to the same feeling that door gives me when I think of wood, and that's probably to do with the double O sound, and maybe the association that door's made of wood. Maybe. I don't know if I can think of. It's really hard to think of something like off the top of my head which gives a similar sort of feeling to a word. It's more like when you hear the two words, you can sort of distinguish their two different feelings from each other, right? So I'm trying to think of wood, like what else? And amusingly, I'm picturing like a plank of wood. I'm not picturing like an actual forest wood, like woods or something. Because amusingly, now that I've got a different definition, now the feeling has changed. Now I said the word, which you might just be like, that's just what like meanings of words are. You're just talking about internalizing the meanings of words, and that itself is giving its definition. But it's like, I need to think of a good example of like where two words are basically unrelated, but they give the same sort of feeling internally to me. It's really hard to think of one off the top of your head, I'm going to be honest. Because the only way I can jump from word to word is through like similar sounding word associations to try, but obviously that's not what I'm looking for. I'm sort of being like, okay, I want to find, you know, just like two people in the world who look similar but are not related. or something like that, you know. I'm like picking one person out, being like, well, I guess it kind of makes sense to look over relatives because there are people who look similar to them, but I'm like, I can't use relatives. I basically had to point to like a completely different place on the globe and be like, hey, you know, do you look similar or don't you look similar to this person? So that sort of search is not usually the way you search for things in the first place, but you're just going to have to trust me on that. And plus, I don't think it would be that hard a concept to understand, I suppose. You know, in a similar way that people have synesthesia, you know, where certain things give like certain impressions. Think of it kind of like that, except for it's not a mixing of senses, it's still the same sense, it's still the intrinsic understanding of something, I suppose. Because if you don't know what synesthesia is, when like senses get mixed together, so certain things, certain sensations in different senses have like bridges and links towards them. So like you might listen to a song and you might see certain colours or imagery evoked in your mind, etc, etc, etc. So it's kind of like that, but just like with concepts, I suppose, or thoughts. But the thing is, if you say something like concepts and thoughts, you try and put like some sort of physical abstraction to it. Not abstraction, physical. What's the opposite of an abstraction? Realization on it, where you're just like, okay, what is a thought? And then you would imagine it as in like a string of text, not maybe a string of text, but the concept of a string of text, I suppose, pervading your mind, right? Or like a list of properties or a list of ideas, etc, etc, which is not really what I mean when I'm describing like how I think about things, or how I picture things, I should say. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a better or worse way to think about things, you know. The better and worse, you know, better in some senses. Sometimes I can think about things quite quickly, I can get the grasp of things without having to, you know, think about specific details. Worse if I'm trying to express myself, as you find myself quite often. I tend to speak in a very sort of like overly rambly way because I have the idea of what I want to say. It's sort of like solidified in my mind, the idea, but it's not like solidified in words. It doesn't have a concrete physical manifestation of itself, which I sort of make up on the fly, which I've certainly got better at over the years. But you know, there's positives and benefits to well many things, to be honest. But it's something which I never really thought about, the fact that I don't tend to think of things through like a dialogue, which other people seem to do. I'm not saying everyone does, because obviously that's not how the word works. You know, no, I'm not literally the only person in the world who doesn't think through dialogue. But it seems to be a somewhat common thing. You know, it seems, I guess, not a somewhat common thing. I should say sort of like the existence of it surprised me when I first learnt about it. And it's more like, it surprised me not in a way that other people did it, but it surprised me that I didn't do it, because that's what I thought I've been doing. But it's really hard to catch yourself doing it, because as soon as you start catching yourself doing it, then you start having sort of like an internal dialogue. Or at least that's what I do, sort of intuitively. I start trying to have internal dialogue because I'm talking like about the thing now in a sort of like meta sense. Hence, I'm kind of having an internal conversation. But sometimes I'll just be thinking about things, and then I'll be like, wait. That's when the conversation starts. Did I do all of that without an internal dialogue, or did I do it with an internal dialogue? And when I reflect back, you know, while, just like a dream, you just sort of got to catch it while it's fleeting. And I'm like, hey, yeah, that entire like sort of thought process I had no internal dialogue. It just ran from one thing to another. So obviously, if it's only something which really happens by myself when I'm not speaking, you know, it's quite. I mean, I guess it still kind of sort of happens subconsciously while I'm speaking, but it's now like my brain is split into two different processes of speaking and the conception of the ideas and what I'm trying to say in behind the scenes in the first place. So I guess it's sort of like working in tandem now rather than being separate things or one being inactive. It's just weird, isn't it? For mine's so strange. Like, if there's any... You know, there's a lot of mysteries out there in the world which people are very curious about, you know, like what's out there in space, you know, how was the world formed, you know, etc, like our greatest ancestors, etc, things like that. But I've really got to be honest that the human mind is really one of the big ones, I think, which people overlook. Just the concept of even being able to create thought in its own right was like own sentient expression. That's so weird, isn't it? I mean, you might be like weird in a philosophical sense. Yes, it is, I suppose, weird, right? You know, the entire brain, or everything it knows about it, has been also made up by the brain itself or something. Which, you know, I guess technically, yeah, that is kind of weird, but that's not what I mean. I mean, I'm literally from like a scientific perspective. Just understanding what the way other people think about things in the first place is so strange, because it's really one of those things you can, like, there's a lot of things you definitely can't, like, experience without living in someone else's shoes, I suppose. But it's sort of like a doubly so for like the way someone's brain works. That's literally something that you could basically never experience, right? You can't have a brain transplant and just be like, yeah, this is it, and this is how your brain works. I get it now. Because, I mean, I suppose your brain is sort of intrinsically tied to who you are, in a way. Like, that's sort of where your sense of self and identity, not maybe identity so much, but sense of self, a sense of the core thought process behind you in the first place, exists in the first place. So can that brain ever experience the experience of another brain? I guess if in the future there's some sort of like neurological link we can put between the two things. Excuse me, my throat. Neurological, like, sort of link, yeah, which sort of like mimics the effects of one brain on the other. Maybe that could be it, but you know, it's just going to be one that has to be one of those mysteries, at least for probably another 10,000 years or something. Excuse me. Well, provided that humanity even lasts 10,000 years, who knows? Maybe. Or sorry, another 10,000 years. I mean, I think humanity's been around for about 10,000 years, probably. I don't know the exact dates. I'm not a historian. Oh no. Yeah. So I guess thought process is basically what I'm talking about. It's just weird, isn't it? How does it work? Also, putting this bench down is going to be a nightmare. Never mind. Just totally super easy, barely an inconvenience. Yeah. And the worst thing I think about it is the fact it's so interesting, especially to talk about and think about, but it's really difficult to put into words, right? Because it's so inherently tied to like an intrinsic internal feeling that it's really hard to sort of like quantify or, you know, create an external experience which mimics it accurately. Because one, you're not even going to like be able to internalize the external experience as other people will, so you don't know if it's accurate in the first place. But two, it's also, you know, you're doing sort of like a translation from the complete abstract and the not the unknowable per se, but the indescribable in a sense, into a very concrete, describable way. But anyway, yeah, I think this is definitely something I've talked about like here and there, but you know, it's something worth talking about. I think, you know, in, like internal dialogue, especially. But there was another interesting question that I remember. My English teacher actually asked back in GCSE times, I think. Excuse me. But and she asked, basically, I mean, she worked under the assumption that everyone had an internal dialogue, which I'd imagine some students in the class who didn't have an internal dialogue are like, what are you talking about? But she was like, is a voice inside your head your voice? And that was an interesting one, because at the time, you know, I was sort of being like, what is the voice inside my head? Because I have a voice, I suppose, inside my head, but it doesn't, the way it doesn't always sound physical, I suppose. So that's not really what I would think of first when I think of a voice inside my head. Yeah, I have thought about that since, but anyway, most people had their voices as being their own voice inside their head. What I've sort of realised now is I don't have just my, I don't think it's, it probably is, it's only ever my voice if I'm like practicing for a speech or something. But most of the time, voices, yes, and you might say voices inside my head are sort of like different voices, and they all give different feelings and sort of like intrinsic like concepts and ideas behind them, I suppose. Sensations is perhaps a much more ambiguous word I can use. They have different sensations with different voices, which sort of speak, but a lot of the times they're not even there in the first place, but they're also still there, if that makes sense. Like, they're the ones talking, but they're not saying words, they're just sort of like conveying concepts to each other. But it's all me, you know. I'm not trying to be like, oh, there's different people living in my head. That's not what I mean. It's more like me being, you know, in the same way when you're a dream, you are just like someone else randomly. It's basically sort of like that, you know. It's still obviously me, and I know it's me, and I intrinsically understand it to be me. But it doesn't have my voice necessarily, or necessarily any concepts which are actually relating to me. Might not even have much of a concept behind it at all. You know, you get it? Or not? Hopefully. But basically, for sort of long and short of an interesting discussion point, basically being like, do you have an internal dialogue? Do you think about when you think about things? Is it like read out loud to you? Do you think in coherent sentences? Was also another very interesting one, and obviously you could probably guess the answer to that for me is no, I don't. I don't think in full sentences. I think in you know, most of the time no sentences and sort of like broken abstract ideas, but sometimes there'll be partial sentences. I find myself, you know, ever since I've been like aware of it, I find myself, you know, this is actually something I do very often, is I will say parts of a sentence, which if you just broke it down is not a sentence in the slightest. It would just be certain words, but then like my mind understands the entire meaning I meant from it as if I said the entire sentence in the first place, which is, you know, obviously quite easy to do when your mind is the one coming up with a concept in the first place, isn't it? So anyway, yeah, internal dialogue. I don't really know where I was going with that, but, you know, another sort of classic philosophical-esque conversation with dear darling. Well, I just rambled for about, I was going to say half an hour, it's not half an hour anymore. But anyway, I'm going to round up this episode here. So if you have been watching, thank you very much. It's been Animal Crossing New Horizons. I've been dear darling. Likes, comments, subscription, shares are greatly appreciated, and Twitter and Discord down below. Hope we see each other again, but for now, it's our farewell. So until next time, bye-bye for now.